"It's a field goal, folks. Kicked by a mule," shouts the TV announcer. "Who is this four-footed football kicker? It's Gus, that's who. He's so terrific. Crooks are plotting to keep him from the Super Bowl kickoff. And you'll kick yourself if you don't read Gus. P.S. Did you see the Disney movie?" Gus by Vic Crume, from the Walt Disney Productions film. Screenplay by Arthur Alsberg and Don Nelson, based on a story by Ted Key, narrated by Amy Mullen. Chapter 1. "Sorry, Mr. Cooper, no sign of him at all." The pilot of the chartered helicopter and his two companions, Hank Cooper and Andy Petrovic, looked down on a tangle of streets and freeways and shopping centers in Los Angeles. Hank Cooper groaned and shook his head. He looked at his watch for the 15th time. 1 hour. 1 hour till doomsday," he muttered. "We'll never find him in time. It's over. Finished." "Not yet, Mr. Cooper," Andy exclaimed, pointing. "Look down there. It's Gus." "Are you sure?" "Mr. Cooper, believe me. It's Gus." "Well, it's a mule, anyway," said the pilot, and he swung the helicopter over to the Topanga Canyon Shopping Center. "How many mules can there be running wild in Los Angeles?" Down in the middle of the parking lot, Gus was fighting his way to what looked to him like the exit. At least people kept disappearing inside some doors. Past parked and moving cars he fled toward his goal. He had never been so scared in his life. "This could turn a mule into an endangered species," he panted, "and all because I wanted to help Andy." As Gus galloped onward, doors clicked open to receive him. He was about to become a mule in an endangered supermarket. For the Topanga Canyon supermarket was what Gus, the kicking mule from Yugoslavia, had rushed into to elude his kidnappers. Through the automatic doors Gus loped, barely missing an exiting customer with bags of groceries. His pursuers didn't miss. On down the aisle went Gus, sideswiping a towering display of canned goods. His pursuers, rolling and stumbling on the cans, chased Gus onward to the bin of fresh tomatoes, where they crashed in red pulp, only to be hit a moment later by an exploding flour sack, courtesy of Gus. And so on. Gus helped demolish that store before he left it, and all because he had wanted to help. What Gus needed now was a little help, himself, to get to the Coliseum in time for the big game. Gus's troubles had really started a few weeks ago, a few thousand miles away in Yugoslavia. It was on a gray, chilly day in Belgrade when Andy Petrovic, a person Gus always tried to help, really hit bottom. Andy was knocked off the top row of the soccer stadium by, of all people, his own father. Andy and his parents were among the 80,000 wildly excited Yugoslavians cheering the closing moments of the year's most important soccer match. Down on the field, a barrel-chested Yugoslavian soccer champ was deftly dribbling the ball goalward through the opposing team. That was Japan, and they give us the writing in parentheses, or the pronunciation, Stjepan Petrovic, Andy's brother. Stjepan Petrovic, Andy's brother. He was a hero, and he was king in the Petrovic family. Andy was, quote, the other one, unquote. Quote, the other one, unquote, was standing in the very top row of the stadium, trying to see between the bulky shoulders of his apple-cheeked parents. It was a hard thing to do because they were bouncing up and down in joy and crushing him at every bounce. Andy thought gloomily, Stepan must be getting to the goalposts. Nearly squashed, Andy managed to glimpse the field and his hero-brother. Papa Petrovic's arms went swinging upward, blocking the view. "Stepan!" he bellowed. "My son! Go! Go!" "Stepan! Stepan!" Mama Petrovic screamed. As Andy peered out from beneath his father's raised elbow, Stepan blasted the ball through the posts. The stands rocked for joy, and Papa Petrovic exploded with enthusiasm. His elbow came speeding down in front of Andy's face, then caught him under the chin as it shot up again. For one unbelievable second, quote, the other one, unquote, rode on his father's shoulder. Then, quietly, unnoticed by all, Andy went sailing back over the stadium wall. Smack! So, you see, it wasn't easy for Gus, then the Petrovic's mule, to watch his best friend, Andy, trying to be something he wasn't, a soccer player. Every day, on the Petrovic farm outside of Belgrade, Andy would practice kicking the ball when he thought no one was looking. The day after the big game, unnoticed by Andy, his parents were also watching as they repaired the barnyard fence. It would always be a painful memory for Gus. Andy, sore as he was from his tumble out of the stands, managed after a few tries to get the ball in the air with his foot. Then, soccer style, he bounced it with his head. It lifted, and Andy stepped back to catch it on his head for a second bounce. Unluckily, he stepped back too far. Right behind him was the barnyard well, and in went Andy right before his parents' eyes. As Gus later commented to a mulish friend, "It was agony to see that disgrace. All I could do was stand there and shake my head. His folks clopped over and began tugging on the well ropes. Up came my little friend, riding the bucket. He couldn't talk for gasping and spluttering, but his papa only stood back and laughed. 'You see, Mama,' he said, 'we have two heroes, one soccer hero and one deep-sea diver hero.' Then his papa strode off to the house. His mama shook her head. 'Andrea,' she told Andy, 'be a good boy. Stay with your butterfly collection.' She gave him a little kiss, then she went into the house. Didn't even say, 'Come on in, son, and get out of those wet clothes.' Poor Andy, he took one look at that soccer ball and said to me, 'Gus, I give up. I wish I never had to see another soccer ball again, as long as I live.' I had to agree, and to show Andy how I felt, I backed up to that soccer ball and let fly. I tell you, Gus chuckled, that ball nearly went over into Hungary. I belted it that hard. And then, what do you think? Andy looks around at me and says, 'Gus, could you do that again?' I couldn't believe my ears. I was just trying to help get rid of that soccer ball, but as it turned out, I was kicking us both right into the future." About the same time that Andy Petrovic was feeling miserable in Yugoslavia, Mr. Hank Cooper was feeling miserable in Thousand Oaks, USA. The balding, worried-looking owner of the California Atoms had good reason to feel bad. Sometimes he even felt so desperate he wished he'd never left his garbage business back east. With a pro football club like the California Atoms, no owner could feel any other way. Not even noticing the fine California sunshine outside, Cooper came out of his office, shoulders drooping, and went up to his young secretary's desk. "I'll be looking at film clips with Venner for a while, Debbie," he said. "Hold my calls, will you?" He chomped down on his unlit cigar and returned to his office, where Coach Venner was waiting nervously. Debbie Kovac, bright and pretty as the California sunshine, watched the door close on her boss. She shook her head. If only someone could help him! The team was so awful. The Addams sure needed something to pull them out of their losing streak. She fingered her dark hair thoughtfully. But then, their losing streak was nothing new. They'd been losing for about 14 years, and that was a long losing streak. Debbie picked up the Yugoslavian newspaper her father still subscribed to. Might as well get my mind off the Addams problems, she said to herself. I'll just see what's happening in Belgrade. Maybe one of Daddy's cousins will be in the news. Anyway, it will be good practice for me to read Yugoslavian. After all, the way things are going around here, I may have to look for another job soon. On my resume, I could always put down that I can translate Yugoslavian. Chapter 2. In Hank Cooper's paneled office, head coach Ernie Venner tried to sound hearty and cheerful when the boss returned. I'm ready to roll the film clips you wanted to see, Mr. Cooper, he said. Hank Cooper plunked down heavily at his desk. Who said I wanted to? I have to. Coach Venner fiddled at the projector. Even thinking about the Addams made him feel nervous, and having to show the owner the latest antics of the worst collection of pro footballers ever put together at any time in sports history made him almost ill. He snapped off the overhead light and started the projector. Now the clip coming up, Mr. Cooper, is Monahan against the Packers. Let's have it, Hank growled. They watched Monahan, the Addams' intrepid quarterback, take the ball from center and spin around to hand off to the running back, who had already gone by him. Monahan then spins in the other direction to hand off to the fullback, but the fullback had also run by him. So once again Monahan spins around and slaps the ball smack into a third runner. The referee! That one cost us a 15-yard penalty, admitted Venner. And it was the smallest loss we had all day, said Cooper. What do you want to do about Monahan, Mr. Cooper? Trade him to the Packers. They ought to love him. He played a better game for them than he did for us, Coach. Venner laughed uneasily as Hank Cooper leaned forward and pressed the desk buzzer to signal for Debbie. Now there's Lindstrom, Coach Venner went on as the clips rolled. What do you want to do about him, Mr. Cooper? The Atom's owner stared at the screen, where Lindstrom was waving vainly for the ball that had been intercepted by a Ram defender, while Lindstrom's back was turned. What's he doing, waving to his girlfriend in the stands? Hank barked. But Lindstrom, already in another play, was putting up his hands to catch the ball. It went through them and hit him on the head. Hank Cooper's hands flew to his own head. Not his girlfriend. He's married, said the coach. That may be why he's asking for more money. He must be out of his head, Hank snapped, and we just saw the blow that did it. What do we do about Zabrowski? Asked the coach, as they saw the Atom's kicker on the screen trip over his own feet and fall on his face. Try the Falcons. They don't want him, replied the coach. I don't think we got anybody they want. Coach, said Hank, pressing the button frantically. We got nobody we want. Just then the office door opened, and in came Debbie. She was carrying a thermos jug of water and a bottle of aspirin. Debbie, said her boss as he half-turned toward her, do me a favor, will you? Debbie nodded. Get your aspirin? I brought it. Hank sighed. Smart girl. I guess you must have seen these film clips. Mr. Cooper, I saw the games. She shook 2 tablets into his hand. He stared at them. Only 2 for this Marx Brothers Film Festival I've been looking at? Coach Venner said hurriedly. Now what about Van Owen, sir? What about him? He was the only bright spot in our defense last season, wasn't he? The film clip rolled to show Van Owen lofting a wobbly kick through the uprights for 3 points. In a wild burst of congratulation, his teammates piled on top of him. When the mass of jerseys, shoulder pads, helmets, and cleated shoes cleared away, there was Van Owen, flat on his back, out cold. Hank Cooper groaned. You ask, what do I want to do with him? I want him back on the squad if he's out of the hospital yet. Venner cleared his throat. Right. But Van Owen wasn't the only bright spot. You won't find a better middle linebacker than Rob Cargill. In fact, we've got a pretty good defense. Our boys have learned to hit a few people. Debbie must have known what was coming. She looked away from the screen. It showed the offensive unit of the Atoms come limping off the field, just as the Atoms' defense came charging out, heads down, to accidentally level their own offense. Pancaked! Hank shuddered. He rubbed his aching forehead. Now if we can only teach them which team to hit, he muttered. More aspirin? Debbie asked gently, holding out the bottle. The owner of the Atoms looked at it sadly. I'd rather you handed me a window, Debbie. I think I could jump. Back again at her desk, Debbie began turning the pages of the Yugoslavian newspaper. She suddenly burst out laughing. What's funny? Hank asked, poking his head out the door of his office. He was surprised by such joy in the Adams office. Debbie tapped a picture at the top of the newspaper page. This. My father gets this paper from Yugoslavia. I brought it in today to look it over. Look. Hank moved over to her desk. A guy and a mule, so what's funny? Debbie explained. He's holding a soccer ball. See? Wait, I'll read it in English. Andrea Petrovic and his mule, Gus. The young farmer has taught his mule to kick 100-yard soccer goals. She looked up at her boss and laughed again. I think that's pretty funny. Hank straightened. Thanks, Debbie. But even if I was Yugoslavian, I'd have trouble laughing these days. But a mule kicking a soccer ball 100 yards, that's a pretty good try. Maybe so, Hank replied gloomily, especially when we got nobody who can kick any kind of ball, even 5 yards. He walked back into his office. When Hank and Joe Barnsdale, the Adams harried publicity man, met the next morning, the Adams training field was already buzzing with action. Down the center of the field, a high school marching band was going through its paces. Following them straggled a bunch of baton twirlers wearing the bright satin colors of the Atomettes. Hank frowned. I see you got the same old faces behind those batons, Joe. Must be nearly time for their pensions. Joe Barnsdale looked uneasy. Well, Mr. Cooper, I think they're going to come up with some new routines for the halftime show that you're really going to like. Before his boss could reply, the band struck up a blaring march. Say, that sounds pretty good. Hank looked pleased for the first time that morning. You got a better outfit there than last year, Joe. In the next second, unhappily for everybody, the drum major dropped his baton. He stopped, bent down to pick it up, and 2 rows of musicians tripped and clanked over him. Amazingly, the band didn't lose a beat. Its bright, blaring sound kept right on blasting across the field. The puzzled Adams owner looked around and spotted a nearby record player. Sound even better when they're not playing, don't they, Joe? He asked. Joe's face turned scarlet. He swallowed. Well, at least we don't get musical goofs this way, Mr. Cooper. We sure don't, Joe. Not musical, that's sure. He sighed. I was counting on the halftime show. Thought at least that could pull in a few people. You know, Joe, when a man's own relatives stop asking for free passes, well, he's in trouble. Joe did his best to look cheerful. Oh, I got a lot of talent for you to look at, Mr. Cooper. He waved to one of the baton twirlers in the straggling line of Atomettes. Come over here, sweetheart, he yelled. Do some of your flip-flops for Mr. Cooper. Okay, Joe, be right with you, she yelled. Instantly, she flip-flopped out of the line, straight toward them. Great, isn't she? Joe asked enthusiastically. Just look at that speed. Speed she had. Too bad she was on a whizzing collision course with the marching band's bass drum. Bam! In one side and out the other. Atomette, drummer, and drum tangled in one horrible heap. Hank shook his head. That could bring in a few people, all right. Especially doctors. He turned away, shoulders sagging. But Mr. Cooper, Joe Barnsdale begged, catching up with his boss. I've got some other ideas, too. For instance, I saw this act on television. An elephant twirls a baton with his trunk. Now you dress him up and... Joe, if I wanted an animal act, I'd get that Yugoslavian mule that kicks 100-yard soccer goals, Hank said wearily. Oh, Debbie showed you that story, too? Say, I'd even pay money to see that. Hank nodded. If it's for real. He stopped walking and stared back at the Atomettes. Might be worth a look, he said thoughtfully. Joe's eyes flashed. All it takes is a round-trip ticket to Yugoslavia for me to find out, he grinned. Takes more than that, his boss answered. It takes somebody to lend me the money for your ticket. Joe's grin faded. Oh. Silently, the two wandered slowly over to Coach Venner and the group of sweat-suited assistant coaches surrounding him. Okay, Venner was saying. Let me run through it once again. Coach Loomis, linemen's calisthenics, the head coach went on. Coach Meadows, blackboard drill. Coach Brody, post-game drills. I think that covers the coaches. Now, how many players do we have here? You got no players here, Coach, came a voice directly behind him. Coach Venner looked around to see his boss eyeing him steadily. None? Venner looked surprised. None. Not due until tomorrow. Coach Venner nodded. Oh. Well, then, we'll save the introductions till then. Hank turned away. Hopeless, he muttered. Hopeless. Joe, Hank said as they walked back to the Atom's office. The more I think about it, the more I think I oughta try digging up some ticket dough. You mean Yugoslavia, Mr. Cooper? I mean Gus the Mule. If he's as good as that newspaper said, we better get Debbie to give you 2 Yugoslavian words to use when you get there. Joe looked puzzled. 2 Yugoslavian words? Hank nodded. Yep. Sign here. Chapter 3. No one was more surprised than Gus at the sudden turn of events around the Petrovic farm. As he remarked later to a mulish friend, you wouldn't think someone would get so much attention doing something that comes naturally. That nice fellow came all the way from America just to see Andy yell, "Whoop!" and me wiggle my ears and kick like a mule. You can bet Mama and Papa Petrovic didn't know what was going on. Gus was right. Andy's parents looked out the farmhouse window and watched Joe Barnsdale watch Gus and Andy perform. Papa shook his head. Can't understand. He comes all the way from America to see the other one? Mama shrugged her plump shoulders. Who knows? I myself think he comes to, quote, get the story, unquote, as they say in that country. Right now he is probably asking Andrea many questions about our Stepan. She beamed and sighed happily. Our Stepan, our hero's son. Papa nodded. Maybe it is so. Andrea does speak the English. He shook his head. And why not? Always with his nose in a book. Or his butterflies, Mama agreed. But then Papa frowned. Still, he does not seem to be speaking the English now. All he is saying is, Whoop! Look at him, showing off his silly trick. Why does the American listen? Mama thought a moment. It is to be polite. But Papa still frowned. Mama, this time I do not agree with you. Andrea is showing off, and that is that. I call him in. He strode to the door. Andrea, he bellowed, bring in the American. We have pictures to show of Stepan. The happy look faded from Andy's face. He turned to Joe. My mother and my father wish you in the house to see pictures of Stepan, he said politely. Oh, who's Stepan? Joe asked. The soccer ball Andy held slipped right out of his hands and bounced along the barnyard. Who's Stepan? He stared, eyes wide, at Joe. You do not know of Stepan? Joe shook his head. Sorry, Andy, I don't. Is he your little brother? Andy gasped. Little brother? Why, he's the greatest. He stopped suddenly, and a huge smile lighted his face. Joe, I make up my mind. If this Mr. Hank Cooper says, come, I, with Gus, go to America with you. Joe grinned. Then I'd better send Mr. Cooper a cable and find out if he says, come. As they walked toward the farmhouse, Joe turned to his new young friend. You speak English very well, Andy. Learn it in school? Andy nodded. And Gus has helped very much, too. Gus? Joe burst out laughing. Oh, yes, it is true, Andy replied. You see, we spend much time together in the fields. Always in the fields I speak the English to him. That way I do not forget the learning at school. And Gus learns too. Joe grinned. You mean Gus hee-haws in 2 languages? Andy didn't smile. Gus is very smart. He feels things. He is nice good friend to me. And he sure can kick, Joe added. Hank Cooper read Joe's cablegram aloud to Debbie. Mule for real. Never misses at 100 yards. Sometimes misses at 110. Sounds great to me, Mr. Cooper. What do you think? Hank hesitated. I don't know. It'll cost a lot. I'm not sure I'm that desperate. He walked over to the window. In the distance, the Adamettes were hard at work on their new halftime routine. A cheerful voice rang out. Hey, Mr. Cooper, how's this? 7 leotard-clad figures formed a wobbly human pyramid. Debbie reached the window in time to see the top Adamette totter madly, fling out her arms, and plunge onto the heap of the collapsed pyramid. Hank cringed, then turned to Debbie. Wire Joe, he exclaimed. I am desperate. Sign the mule. Rob Cargill, the Atom's hulking linebacker, and Debbie Kovac were playing cards at the coffee table. Debbie, even though it was only 8 o'clock in the evening, was having a hard time staying awake. Rob's bulky frame seemed to fill Debbie's small motel apartment at the Thousand Oaks training camp, and his big, slow voice went on and on. "Well, you see it was like this," he said, holding a card suspended in the air. "I blitzed up the center, blew past the pulling guard, dumped the blocking back, and nailed this guy for a 10-yard loss." He paused and stared down at the cards on the table. "Turned out to be one of the coaches," he finished sadly. Luckily, the loud ring of the telephone drowned out Debbie's giggle. "I bet that's Mr. Cooper," she said. "He told me he'd let me know Joe's answer." She hurried to the phone. "Hello? Oh, hi, Mr. Cooper." "How would you like to babysit for a Yugoslavian mule and his trainer, Debbie?" Hank asked. "You signed them?" Debbie asked eagerly. "Got his hoofprint on the dotted line. But I gotta ask you a favor, Debbie. Since the mule's trainer is Yugoslavian, and you're Yugoslavian—" "Wait a minute, Mr. Cooper. My parents are, or were, but now we're all Americans." "Well, okay, that's close enough. I'm putting you on detached duty and assigning you to the kid, Andy, for a week or so, to keep him from getting homesick." Debbie laughed. "Well, I haven't done any folk dancing or cooked any pork raznichi lately, but I'll do my best to make him feel at home." Rob heard a few more crackling words, and then Debbie said, "Got it. Andy Petrovic. Bye. See you in the morning." Rob scowled as Debbie hung up. "What were you promising there? Are we going together or not?" Debbie smiled. "It's only for a week or so. Mr. Cooper's orders. I'm supposed to be a sort of welcoming committee for our new halftime stars." "Yeah? And what am I supposed to be doing while you're making the Yugoslavian yokel feel at home?" Debbie grinned. "You can learn how to play cards, dum-dum." "Rummy!" Debbie put down her cards with a satisfied grin. The jetliner made its graceful descent and taxied up to the gate. Debbie couldn't be sure, but she thought she caught a glimpse of Gus's face pressed close to a window in the plane. Soon a line of passengers, including Gus, was riding toward her on a movable walkway. From Gus's point of view, everything in this new land looked wonderful. He gazed at the big terminal building and the people crowded around. "America," he thought. "Land of opportunity. A chance for Andy and me to kick our way right into his papa's heart." Debbie, looking radiant, waved and called to Andy. Gus said later about that moment, "We couldn't have had a nicer, more beautiful guide than Debbie. Things were looking good at the very beginning. If we'd gone back to the farm right then and there, we would have been ahead. Everything seemed to be coming our way." One thing coming their way later was luggage. Andy's suitcase was the first to slide down the chute. "All set, Andy?" Debbie asked. "Wait, please," came Andy's reply. "Gus does not travel so light as I. We must await his bale of hay." Debbie smiled. She reached up and stroked Gus's soft muzzle. "You certainly don't travel light, Gus. First time I've ever met a passenger with a bale of hay for luggage." Hardly had Gus finished a hearty morning breakfast of tossed Yugoslavian hay and American oats, then another new experience loomed before him, meeting the sports reporters at Thousand Oaks training camp. "I guess you'd call it an interview." Gus twitched his ears as he recalled the scene later. "Everybody seemed to be there. Mr. Cooper, Joe Barnsdale, all those reporters. and a very rude football player that Debbie called Rob. Hank Cooper was the first to greet the 5 sports reporters who had been promised a real story for their newspapers. "I hate to tell you this, Hank," said the Chronicles man, looking over to where the Atomettes were practicing. "But if you got us out here to see the Atomettes, well, they'll never take the place of the 3 Stooges." Hank smiled. "You get ready to feel like 5 Stooges. Here comes your story." The 5 reporters looked around to see Debbie and Joe and Andy walking toward them. Clomping steadily along at Andy's side was Gus, looking young, handsome, and feeling his oats. "Fellas," Hank beamed, "say hello to Andy and Gus." "The greatest halftime act in all of professional football, direct from Yugoslavia," Joe added. The Inquirer reporter stared at Gus. "I'll bite. What's he do?" Hank called over to Rob Cargill. "Hey, Rob, throw Andy the ball." Rob looked toward Andy. "Yes, sir. Here you are, Andy. Welcome to the NFL." And with those words he cranked back his arm, threw a hard spiral pass, and caught Andy square in the midsection. Andy doubled up, clutching his stomach instead of the ball. "You okay, kid?" Hank asked in alarm. Andy gasped. "Oh, yes, sir. My brother does it all the time." Hank turned to the reporters. "Now, gentlemen, when you see the mule kick this ball—" Andy interrupted him. Mr. Cooper, Gus has never kicked a ball like this before." "Uh-oh," the reporter from the Evening Sun grinned. "Once again it's agony time in Atomland, boys. Come on, let's go." "Now, hold it, fellas," Hank said. "Just a minute." He turned to Andy. "Can't you get him to try? For the kind of dough I laid out, I'm at least entitled to see him miss." Debbie smiled encouragingly. "Just try it, Andy." Andy gave her a worried look, but he bent down and tried to stand the football on end near Gus's hind legs. But footballs are not made to stand alone. Andy's effort was getting nowhere. "With your finger, kid," Hank begged. "Hold it with your finger." Andy knelt down beside Gus again. With the ball balanced, he looked up at Hank. "Like this?" he asked. "Okay. Now how do you get him to kick?" "I usually ask, 'Ready, Gus?' Then when he wiggles his ears, I just yell, 'Hoop!'" Gus got the message. With one mighty kick, he belted the ball skyward. It sailed end over end in the air and on through the goalposts a good 100 yards away. Hank, Debbie, and Joe looked delighted. Andy looked relieved. Rob Cargill looked stunned. And the reporters looked just the way Hank Cooper hoped they would, astonished. The Chronicle reporter nodded. "Say, that was all right. If it's no fluke, you might have come up with a winner there, Hank." "Yeah," the Evening Sun's man laughed. "You'll have a halftime show that'll make the Atom fans forget about the team." That was the moment Gus realized he had a second person on his hands, or hooves, who needed help. That nice guy, Hank Cooper. Chapter 4. In the broadcast booth, the Atom's announcer, along with the usual TV camera staff, viewed the field below. "Well, so far in this opening exhibition game, the Atoms haven't disappointed us a bit, folks," said the sportscaster. "Same old no score and 20 seconds to go in the first half. It's Cleveland Browns 27, California Atoms 0. Manders in kick formation for Cleveland. standing on his own 30. Uh-oh, a high center, right over Mander's head. There's a scramble for the ball, and Rob Cargill has it. But he's downed immediately on the Browns' 12-yard line. What a break for the Adams. They've got 8 seconds to get on the scoreboard. Every player on the Atom bench leaped up. Coach Venner was nearly out of his wits with delight at this favorable turn of events. "Field goal, team!" he yelled excitedly. Along with assistant coach Garcia, several players stepped forward. "Garcia!" Coach Venner exploded. "Why aren't you in uniform?" "Oh, you're one of the coaches." O'Brien, where's my place kicker?" "He just went out to kick the field goal, Coach," Garcia answered quietly. "Oh, good, good." Coach Venner turned as the ball was snapped for O'Brien's try for the field goal. The Atom place kicker carefully studied the ball, swung his foot, missed completely, but watched his shoe sail through the air and between the uprights. On the sidelines, Hank Cooper covered his eyes in pain. At the far end of the tunnel leading from the stadium to the playing field, Andy and Gus stood ready for the halftime show signal. At least Gus was ready. His tilted eyes glowed when he heard the crowd yelling. His pleased glance went to Andy. To his horror, he saw his friend trembling from head to foot inside the Atom uniform marked with the big numeral 0. Even the brightly colored football he held seemed to be quivering. Gus, himself, was wearing a blanket in the Atom colors, and red and white leggings on all 4 legs. On his head was a specially designed football helmet made to give him ample room for ear signaling. Briefly, he nestled his muzzle on Andy's shoulder pads. "I am being punished for collecting butterflies," Andy whispered. "Even now, their ghosts flutter wildly in my stomach." Gus tossed his head in disapproval. That toss said a lot. Andy felt Gus's lack of sympathy. "Don't fail me, Gus," he begged. Gus could barely keep from braying back, "Just don't you fail me." A booming voice from the loudspeakers reached their ears. "Now, folks, the moment you've all been waiting for. You've read about them in the papers, and now you're going to see them in person." The Atomettes lined up at the stadium tunnel entrance. All turned their heads toward the expected arrivals. "Here they are, folks, direct from Yugoslavia. Andy and his miracle mule, Gus." Gus felt Andy suddenly totter beside him. "We're on, Gus. Forward, trot," he said weakly. Between the double line of satin-flashing Atomettes, the 2 Yugoslavians made their entrance. There was a fanfare of trumpets. Gus lifted his head proudly, but that same blare was turning Andy into wobbling jelly. By the time they reached their position on the 5-yard line, he was near collapse. "I'll say this, folks," the Adams announcer's voice came over the loudspeakers. "If Andy and his friend Gus are half as good as their press notices, the fans here will get a lot more to cheer about than they did in that first half." Andy moaned. "So many people, Gus," he gasped. "I don't think I can go through with it." Gus looked at him in amazement, thinking, he can't go through with it. Andy looked away from Gus, took 2 backward steps, glanced up at the noisy crowd, and ran. Gus stared in disbelief. Then he wheeled and went toward the tunnel entrance at a dignified pace. Debbie, Joe, and Hank Cooper watched the strange performance in alarm. "What's he doing to me?" Hank gasped. "I think he was frightened by the crowd," Debbie replied worriedly. "The crowd? At an atom game? He should see a crowd." "Well, I guess after the farm it seems like a crowd too." "Hey, look!" Joe Barnsdale exclaimed. "They're coming back." It was true. A determined Gus, his nose pressed firmly into Andy's back, was nudging his friend onto the field. As the crowd roared with laughter, Gus moved to the 5-yard line and pushing Andy every step of the way. "At least the crowd's laughing, Mr. Cooper," Joe said. "Yeah, they're gonna laugh me right into bankruptcy," came Hank's gloomy reply. Out on the field, Gus relaxed his pressure on Andy's backbone, but didn't relax his stern expression. "It's all right, Gus," Andy said, not even hearing the shouts and laughs in the stands. "Thanks. You'll never have to go through that again. You'll see." Gus turned his hindquarters toward the farthest goal-posts. "I hope not," he thought. "It's bruised every bone in my head." "Ready?" Gus wig-wagged his ears, the past forgotten and forgiven in the thrill of the moment. "Hoop!" Andy yelled. The fans had never, in all their days of watching field goals kicked, seen such power, such distance traveled, such success. The ball sailed end over end down the entire field to where the Atomettes had built a pyramid on the Atom's 10-yard line. Just as the top girl was extending her arms triumphantly, the football came whizzing toward the goalposts and caught her in the stomach. The pyramid crashed again. The crowd cheered that, too. But Hank Cooper wasn't cheering. An idea had flashed into his head, an idea so brilliant that it seemed to him to light up the whole stadium. Only a faint smile gave Debbie and Joe a clue that their boss was pleased. On the 6 o'clock news, the sportscaster beamed out from Hank's TV screen. "The Atoms lost to the Browns, 41-0 this afternoon. But the halftime show with Andy and Gus, the Mule, was something else. After a shaky start, that 4-legged Atom put 3 100-yard kicks straight through the uprights. Hank Cooper may have found himself a real drawing card. The question is, will it be enough to pull the ex-garbage king out of the dumps? Financial, that is. This sportscaster doesn't think so." Hank snapped the TV switch. "Yeah? Well, this club owner thinks yes." He smiled happily into the no-picture screen. Sooner or later, Charlie Gwynn, who had loaned Hank some money, was bound to stop by the Atom office, to prove his friendship, of course. So Hank wasn't surprised the morning Charlie arrived with a legal-looking paper in his hand. "The note, Hank," he said. "It's 10 days overdue. I loved the Mule, but there's no way you're going to make enough money to pay this off with a half-time carnival act." He took out a second paper. "So here's my offer for the team." Hank glanced at it, then pushed his coffee cup to one side. He shook his head. "Way under, Charlie. Way under. If I gotta sell, there's no one I'd rather sell to. That's the old spirit of friendship, you know. But I got 3 better offers." Charlie's eyes turned chilly. "That's my top, Hank." Hank pressed his fingers together. "Well now, let's see, Charlie. I don't want to sell. You can't afford to buy. But we're old friends, right?" "What have you got in mind?" Charlie asked suspiciously. Hank smiled and waved his unlit cigar. You're a guy who likes to take a chance. I think I got a deal for you. Like what? Like, say we make a bet. I win, I keep the club. I lose, you buy it, at your price. Charlie Gwyn's eyebrows rose. Interesting. What's the wager? I say the Adams will win half their ball games. 7 games? That's more wins than they've had in the past 10 years put together. Hank grinned. So it's not a bad bet, huh? What's the catch? No catch. Charlie studied his well-kept fingernails. I'll tell you what, Hank, I have a better bet for you. Any team that can go from 0 to 7 wins can go from 0 to taking the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl? Charlie Gwyn nodded. A bet was your idea, Hank. So if you want to hang on to the team, well, he shrugged. But Charlie, the Super Bowl! Hank pleaded. I want to hang on to the team. You're digging my grave. Charlie Gwyn replied, What are friends for? Hank Cooper's cigar dropped right into his coffee cup. Gus instantly fell in love with Carl Lucum's 2-acre ranch. Mr. Cooper had rented the place for Gus and Andy. Besides the ranch house, there was a barn and a small corral. The few goats, chickens, and 1 cow reminded Gus a little bit of home. He liked Mr. Lucum, too. During the afternoon, Gus enjoyed the shade of the barn. He could rest, munch the new supply of hay, and still keep an eye on any action outside, such as Debbie's little white Volks convertible whizzing up the driveway, as it was doing this minute. She hopped out of the car, Andy bounced out of the house, and both began strolling toward the barn. Oh! Debbie reached in her purse. Here, before I forget. This is for you, Andy. A letter from Yugoslavia. It came to the office. Hiya, Gus. It's from my family, Andy said, smiling eagerly. Maybe Papa got the clipping I sent to him. I'm sure they're very proud, Debbie said, patting Gus's back. Gus looked over Debbie's head and watched the smile fade from Andy's face. He nodded in Andy's direction. Debbie looked around. Bad news? Andy sighed. Good news. About my brother Stjepan. Papa says he played brilliantly against Brazil, kicking 2 goals. Anything else? Debbie asked hopefully. He did even better against Italy. Stjepan kicked 4 goals and won the game single-handed. Debbie looked puzzled. Where does he mention you? In the P.S., down here at the bottom. I'll read it. We received your newspaper clipping, but could not read it because of the caviar spilled on it during Stjepan's victory celebration. Andy shook his head. Same old Papa. Isn't there something I could do to cheer you up? Debbie asked. How about my writing you a really cheerful letter? Andy glanced up. Or how about going to dinner with me? Debbie hesitated. I'd love to, Andy, but I have a date with Rob. Oh. Gus's keen ears picked up the sad sound of that oh. He looked pleadingly at Debbie. You know, Andy, she explained, I haven't seen him very much lately. I just don't see how I could break it. Gus blinked, and a sly look came into his eyes. Suddenly he moaned loudly. Andy and Debbie whirled around in time to see his knees buckle With a second loud moan, he dropped down into the hay and rolled over on his side, eyes closed. "Gus! Gus!" Andy cried out. "What is it? What is wrong?" Gus didn't move. "I'll call the vet," Debbie said, starting toward her car. "No, Debbie. You go ahead with your plans. I'll take care of this. Don't be silly. If Gus is sick, I want to be here. I'll cancel the date with Rob." Gus allowed himself a slight lift of an eyelid, but as things seemed to be going very well, he quickly closed it and moaned some more. Dr. Morgan, the kindly old vet Carl Lucum called, put his stethoscope back into his black bag. "I'd like to say I cured him," he chuckled, "but the fact is, this mule's healthy as a horse." Gus, who was now on his feet, certainly looked chipper. "Is there anything we can give him, Dr. Morgan?" Andy asked anxiously. "Give him? Find out what's keeping him so healthy and give it to me." He waved his hand. "Well, see you, folks." Over Gus's neck, Debbie smiled at Andy. "It was a miracle, wasn't it, the way Gus recovered?" "Yes, I think so too," Andy replied. "Now again I am happy." He looked shyly at Debbie. "You know, in my country, when the dinner date is cancelled, it is cancelled." Debbie laughed and patted Gus's neck. "That seems a good custom, Andy." She smiled. "Okay, cancelled it stays." Andy smiled joyfully. "We go!" As Gus watched them leave, a satisfied glow shone from his eyes, possibly due to all the rest he'd been getting in the past hour. Chapter 5. Rob Cargill, seething with rage, burst into the room he shared with teammate Calvin Barnes. "I don't believe it," he stormed. "Stood me up in front of a Chinese restaurant for 2 hours. And I don't even like Chinese food." "I left you a note," Cal said. "Didn't you see it? Debbie said she couldn't make it. Something about Gus, the mule, being sick. Guess she had to sit up with him or something." "Gus the mule!" Rob exploded. "I've got those Yugoslavians coming out of my ears." He grabbed the telephone and dialed Carl Lucum's number. The conversation Cal heard was short and not very sweet. "Debbie there? She isn't? Where is she? Out back with the mule? No? No message, thanks. I'll deliver it myself." Slam. Rob strode to the door. "Sick mule. She's at the drive-in with the sick mule's nursemaid. Wait till I see that guy." Rob roared right by the ticket taker and on into the drive-in, up one aisle and down the next. He finally spotted a white Volks convertible and slammed on his brakes. In 2 swift strides, he was banging his hand on the steamed-up car windows. "Debbie! Debbie! Would you mind stepping out of there?" There was no sign that whoever was in the car had even heard a sound. "Debbie! I know you're in there." No response. "Okay, if you won't come out, then I'll come in." He gave the door handle a hard tug. It broke off in his hand. So, like peeling a banana, with one powerful jerk, Rob peeled back the convertible top. His eyes almost popped. The girl was not Debbie, and her date was no slightly built young Yugoslavian. Slowly rising from the little car was a giant with shoulders like Hoover Dam. "I'm sorry," Rob choked. "Really sorry." He stepped backward as 6 feet 10 inches of muscle reached out for him. Rob gasped. "Oh boy, am I sorry." The half-empty stands blazed with light, and the strains of the Star-Spangled Banner filled the air. Down on the field, Gus stood at attention and slanted one ear in a snappy salute to the national anthem. In the announcer's booth, he could see the famous sportscasters, Pepper Allen and John Unitas. One, in particular, seemed to have a lot on his mind. It was Mr. Allen. "Gentlemen," he was saying, "I view it as totally incomprehensible that this Atom team, a team that managed to negotiate an entire exhibition season without one victory, nay, without scoring one single touchdown, could be opening on the Monday night game of the week. It could only be through the efforts of one man, Pepper," John Unitas answered him. "Hank Cooper." "You're so right, John," Pepper replied. "Hank Cooper, a giant among pygmies. The ex-garbage king whose dubious fortune has been earned by parlaying your ash can and mine into the team we see lining up tonight. A team whose apparent future belongs in those same ash cans." "Wonder what all that was about," Gus blinked. He was pleased to hear Unitas instantly explain. "In other words, you like its chances, Pepper?" John Unitas looked down on the field. "Well, the Green Bay Packers are getting ready to kick off." Gus turned his attention to the game. "There's the kickoff," Unitas said. "Malloy really put his toe into that one, right in and out of the end zone." "And the Atoms get the first break of the game," Pepper added. "They don't have to run it back. Now it's the Atoms' ball, 1st and 10 on their own 20. Ellis will be calling signals. Now you and I know, John, that the Atoms don't have much of a backfield. Pepper, everybody knows it. If I were that quarterback, I'd come out throwing. Pass, pass, pass. It's their only chance." Gus then listened to a few hut-hut-huts from the field, a favorite word in football he'd discovered. "Thrown back 4 yards," John Unitas announced. The Atoms came up to the line of scrimmage on 2nd down. Hut, hut, hut. The quarterback hands off to the running back. The entire offensive team blocks to the right, but the running back goes to the left and is smeared under a swarm of Green Bay tacklers. "Now that was a typical Atom power play," Pepper Allen commented. "The Atom offense went to the right, but someone forgot to tell Birkin, their ball carrier. He went left." John Unitas laughed. "Well, here they come out of the huddle again." "And what a shame they can't just stay in it," Allen said. John Unitas described the play. "The Atoms' Ellis is dropping back to pass. He's looking downfield. Now he's scrambling out of the pocket, throwing toward the sideline. A long one. That boy has some arm." "How right you are," Allen agreed. "Yes, some lucky fan in row 14 has caught himself a souvenir of the ball game." Coach Venner decided it was time to punt, but Hank Cooper decided it was time to try for a field goal. "Andy!" he shouted. "You and Gus get over here." Puzzled, Gus glanced at Andy. He was sure it wasn't time for the halftime show, but he followed as Andy rose from the bench. Up in the announcer's booth, John Unitas eyed the scene, almost as puzzled as Gus. "There seems to be some confusion down there. The mule has romped onto the field." "That's the now famous Gus, folks. I hear tell he's been kicking 100-yard field goals at halftime all exhibition season," Allen commented. "I guess someone gave him the wrong cue." "His trainer, Andy, is out there with him, Pepper," John Unitas said. "And he'll be leading him back to the bench any moment now," Allen replied. "You can't blame Gus, folks. He's been the star attraction here since his arrival in this country. No doubt a little ham has gotten into the young mule." Down on the field, the Green Bay Packers started yelling, "Get the mascot off the field! Leave him alone! He's just bringing in the signals! Bet he's got the highest IQ in that backfield!" Andy and Gus trotted up to the Atom huddle. "You're going to do what?" Rob Cargill exclaimed. "Mr. Cooper's orders," Andy answered. "Someone centers me the ball, I hold it, Gus kicks it, and we score a touchdown." "Not a touchdown, you Yugoslavian midget," Rob snarled. "A field goal. 3 points, if they're crazy enough to let us get away with it." He glanced back to the Atom sideline where Hank Cooper, Coach Venner, the assistant coaches, and some players were facing the referee, the umpire, and the head linesman. "You'd better get that mule off the field, Mr. Cooper," the referee was saying, "unless you want to forfeit the game." "No, no," Coach Venner exclaimed excitedly. "We don't want to forfeit the game, do we, Mr. Cooper? We're not forfeiting anything. The mule stays in and he kicks." "Seems to be an argument over there," Pepper Allen told the fans. He shook his head. "No way are they going to permit that mule to kick." "The referee is talking to someone on the field phone, Pepper," Unitas observed. "Forgive me, John," Allen replied, "but I have been a devotee of professional football almost from its inception, and I say conclusively and without fear of contradiction that there is no way they will permit that mule to kick. No way!" John Unitas handed Pepper an official-looking bulletin. "How about this way, Pepper?" "There is no way!" Allen went on before glancing down at the bulletin. Then the fans heard a gasp come over the loudspeakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Pepper Allen. Might I have your kind indulgence, if you please?" Quiet came over the stadium as every fan wondered what was happening out on the field. "I have been asked to read a bulletin," came Pepper Allen's voice. "To wit, according to the official rules of the National Football League, Rule 5, Section 1, the game is to be played by 2 teams of 11 players each. The rule book does not define the word, quote, player, unquote. It is the understanding of the officials of this game that a player could be a man, a woman, or any member that a team chooses to represent them on the field. And so—" There was an absolute hush. Allen paused. "And so, ladies and gentlemen," he continued, "the mule, Gus, will therefore be permitted to play." The Green Bay coach said more than that. Hank Cooper simply smiled. And in the booth, Pepper Allen shook his head, stunned. John Unitas looked over at his fellow sportscaster. "Like you say, Pepper, there's no way." He grinned faintly. Charlie Gwynn sat behind his expensive desk in his expensive office, looking at the newspaper headline, "Atoms Ride Mule to Victory." He snarled into his telephone. "The mule was a cheap trick, Hank." "Cheap trick?" Hank's voice came back. "After that cheap bet you stuck me with? So, okay, I stuck you with a mule, and Gus won the game. Okay?" "You'll never get away with it, Hank!" Charlie Gwynn boiled back. A chuckle came over the line. "No, you wouldn't like to make a second bet, would you, Charlie?" For an answer, Charlie Gwynn slammed down the phone. Chapter 6. Delighted, Gus learned that his brilliant field goal kicking had resulted in an excellent job for himself and Andy on the Addams payroll. No longer would they simply be halftime show entertainers. They'd be right in there kicking points for Mr. Cooper. It would be nice for Andy to send home a big headline. Yugoslavian athletes rock U.S. sports world. That would give Papa Petrovic something to think about. Gus brayed. Now, 4 weeks into the football season, Gus and Andy were ready to join the other Atoms for another winning game, this time against the San Francisco 49ers. The announcer was all smiles. Another crystal-clear evening here in Atom Stadium and another capacity crowd, he beamed. The fans in this sunny city have gone daffy. Who is undefeated and in a tie for first place in the Western Division? Why, our own California Atoms. Now, down to the field for the introductions. One by one, the Atoms ran out onto the field as the announcer called names, numbers, and weights. At 2:35, number 77, Rob Cargill, he said as Rob trotted out, glaring straight ahead. And weighing in at 1,374 pounds, number 00, Gus Petrovic. Gus moved briskly out to join the team gathered around Coach Venner. He was just in time for the end of the pep talk. "Okay, men," the coach barked. "This is another tough one. I want a 40-man effort. You with me?" As the other Atoms shouted out, "Yeah, you bet, gotcha, right on," Gus added a clear and true hee-haw. Coach Venner rolled his eyes skyward. "That mule makes me sound silly no matter what I say." In the first quarter, Gus and Andy built up the Adams score to read 49ers 0, Adams 9. When they trotted back to the bench, Debbie blew them a kiss. It was all Rob Cargill needed. "I'll get that guy if it's the last game I ever play," he grated. It was almost the last game that Andy ever played. Tucker, the 49er quarterback, threw a pass out toward the Atom sideline. It sailed over the receiver's head, and although the pass had been incomplete, Rob Cargill barreled toward the Atom bench to, quote, accidentally, unquote, slam into number 0. Andy was out cold. "It was an accident, I tell you," Rob shouted at Hank Cooper, the coach, and players who crowded around their fallen teammate. Hank glared at Rob, then bent over Andy. Kid, say something. Are you okay?" Andy opened blurry eyes. He tried to sit up. Then, throwing his arms around Hank, he weakly kissed him on the cheek. "I did it all for you, Papa." Poor 135-pound Andy sank back, once again unconscious. During the middle of the second quarter, the announcer was heard to say, "Well, we haven't seen the Yugoslavian field goal combination since young Andy was injured in the first quarter. But with the Atoms ball on their own 27, it sure looks like field goal time now." At the Atom bench, Coach Venner was frantic. "O'Brien to hold? Oh, I don't think so, Mr. Cooper. He's never held for Gus." Hank nearly bit his cigar in two. "Look," he exclaimed, "the mule kicks the field goals, and I sign your paycheck." "O'Brien!" Coach Venner instantly yelled. "Get in there with Gus." O'Brien looked worried. He got out on the field and bent down by Gus's rear hooves. "Here goes, Gus. Just don't mistake my helmet for the ball, will you?" But Gus had more to worry about than O'Brien. He gave him a brief look, then trotted back toward the Atoms bench. Gus! Come back here!" O'Brien shouted. "Gus!" Hank Cooper exclaimed. "Don't be too hard on him, Mr. Cooper," Coach Venner said. "He's only a rookie." Hank could only glare, and keep on glaring, as the clock showed only 12 seconds left in the game, with the score now 49ers 10, Adams 9. Already fans were beginning to file out of the stadium. It was field goal kicking time again. But with Gus gone, the fans weren't bothering to wait for the sad ending. Looking up toward the stands, Hank Cooper had a sudden brainstorm. "Gus kicks the field goal," he barked. "But how?" Coach Venner almost wept. "You know nobody but Andy can hold for him." "I got an idea," the Adam owner replied. Departing fans stopped in their tracks as they heard the announcer say, "Folks, now I've seen everything. I've seen many a player carried off the field on a stretcher, but I've never seen this. Number 0 is being carried on the field on a stretcher." Andy was gently lowered to the ground. Weakly he called signals for the ball, placed it down, and feebly called, "Hoop." Without even waiting to wiggle his ears, Gus boomed the ball through the goal posts. The fans exploded with joy. Charlie Gwynn and his lawyer, Cal Wilson, were doing a lot of thinking, and thinking hard. "Cal, they've won 4 in a row. They're tied for first place." "Relax, Charlie. What chance have they got to go to the Super Bowl anyway?" "Crazy." Charlie shook his head. "It's a definite possibility, and you know it." "Then what we gotta do is get an edge." "You got something in mind?" Charlie asked hopefully. "Calm down," Cal replied. "I'm gonna work on it." It didn't take Cal's energetic brain too long to work at any time. It could work even faster for wealthy Charlie Gwynn. And the minute he remembered his old buddies, Spinner and Crankcase, he knew Charlie's problem was solved. "If anyone can keep those Yugoslavians off the team, those guys can," he exclaimed. The more he thought about it, the more pleased he became with the idea. Spinner and Crankcase had worked as a team for years, even going to jail together, and what one couldn't do, the other one could. Best of all, in Cal's opinion, was that neither of them worried much about what they did. "Talented guys!" Cal's eyes gleamed. "All I gotta do is think out the plan, then give them a call." Within a half hour, he was on the phone to Charlie Gwynn. "Listen, Charlie, I got everything all set. You see, I got these guys I know. Real pals. They're gonna take care of everything for just 25 G's. That figure okay with you? Good. No, I won't say more now. I'll tell you when I see you. Understand?" "The $25,000 figure is okay," Charlie replied. "But you don't have anything really rough in mind, do you, Cal? I don't want trouble." "Rough?" Cal cackled. "They'll treat 'em like babes in arms. All I'm willing to say now is that there are certain sports personalities whose plans are going to be changed. Fast." He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. "Now for step 1. I gotta get Spinner and Crankcase into a motel. They can work it out from there." One of Spinner's many talents was imitating voices. He could sound like just about anybody. Businessman, sportscaster, news reporter, butcher baker, or candlestick maker. Right now, he was stretched out comfortably on his motel room bed, telephone in hand, being a sports columnist. He winked at Crankcase and Cal as he spoke into the phone. "Slayko speaking. Lester Slayko, sports columnist with United Press International. We thought there might be a nice, warm human interest story about the ranch where Gus the Mule is staying. Cal and Crankcase listened carefully as Spinner went on. Wonder if you'd answer a few questions? Good. I gather Gus sleeps in a barn? His own stall? With security, I assume. He winked again at Cal and Crankcase. Oh, no security as yet. And you drive him to the stadium on Sundays? Oh, I see. Gordon horse vans pick him up? After a few more questions, Spinner hung up, then reached for the telephone directory. Gordon, here we are. Gordon horse vans. He dialed the number. This time he used a deep, executive-type voice. Gordon horse vans? Adams front office here. We'll be sending our own driver out for the horse van tomorrow morning. That's the usual time of, got it. 9 o'clock. Thank you. He smiled and put down the phone. That was beautiful, Spinner, Crankcase said. You got all the info we need. Cal looked pleased. You haven't lost your old touch, Spinner. You just put me in touch with those 25 G's. Spinner grinned. You keep the Adams and that mule out of the Super Bowl, and you'll have money in every bank in the country, Cal replied. Crankcase laughed. That'll be a switch, huh, Spinner? Us putting money into a bank. Sunday morning, Andy walked Gus from the stable to the station wagon, towing a horse trailer marked Gordon Horse Vans. Crankcase grinned into the rear-view mirror before stepping out of the wagon. So that's the famous mule, he exclaimed. He reached up and patted Gus on the neck. Heard a lot about you, Andy, old boy. I'm Andy. That's Gus, Andy said politely. Are you a new driver? Just new on this route, Crankcase answered quickly. You gotta pardon me for mixing up names. I'm not very good on names and faces, but I've been wheelman on lots of jobs, if that's what's worrying you. You do know the way to the stadium? Andy asked. Crankcase laughed heartily. Know the way? I know a shortcut you wouldn't believe. We'll load the mule and be there in no time. In the locker room, Hank Cooper padded back and forth like a nervous cat. They could have been here by now if Gus had ridden in on Andy, he fumed. It's been 3 hours since Lukum saw them leave the ranch. It's only 11:30, Coach Venner said in a soothing voice. Don't give me it's only 11:30, Lou barked. Where are those 2 Yugoslavians? They've never been late before. What are they taking? The Orient Express? Far from being comfortably seated on that famous train, Andy was nervously twitching about on the front seat of Crankcase's station wagon parked at a crossroads. Crankcase was studying a highway map. Can't figure it out, he sighed. That shortcut just disappeared. He pointed ahead. The stadium should be that way. Andy stared in the direction of Crankcase's stubby finger. That way it is not, he said sternly. Cannot you see for yourself? Crankcase looked at the scene before them. He certainly could see for himself. See miles of rolling farmland. He tried to sound sad. A beautiful place to live, but I wouldn't want to stay here, would you? Andy nearly exploded. I would not! Perhaps you should have taken the long cut and taken us to the stadium in time for the game. You're a worrier, kid, Crankcase replied. Leave it to me. I left it to you, Andy blazed. I should have left it to me. Never will we get to the game in time. Chapter 7. Andy's worst fears came true. He and Gus had missed the whole game by the time driver crankcase brought them back from the tour of Southern California. Now it was Blue Monday in the Atom office. "Mr. Cooper," Debbie buzzed. "Mr. Gwyn's on the phone. Want to talk with him?" "You bet," Hank snapped. Charlie's voice came on the line, oozing sympathy. "It's a shame, Hank. Mule missed the whole game, huh?" "Yeah," Hank replied in a hard voice. "Very funny thing happened. Somebody rung in a phony driver. And I'll tell you this, Charlie, whoever tries it again is going to get a tail full of buckshot." As her boss slammed down the phone, Debbie came into the office with aspirin and water. He waved it away. Debbie, don't need it. I got Charlie Gwyn put away. I hired some Pemberton men to guard Gus and Andy. I think you can retire that bottle of aspirin." Sunday, the day of the football game with the Kansas City Chiefs, had come. Coach Venner was speaking over the stacked hands of his players. "We've won together. We've lost together. But first place is waiting for us, men. This week we're gonna get off the ground and win." Gus looked over at his teammates and the coach. He noted the stacked hands, and 00 took action. He swiftly trotted over to the group, and in his pledge of loyalty showed the Atoms he was with them all the way. Down came his hoof on Rob Cargill's hand. Before Rob could say, "Ouch!" the referee's whistle blew. "Everybody up for the kickoff!" Coach Venner yelled. It was the Atoms game from start to finish, with Gus taking the usual honors for fine team play. The final score, Atoms 21, Chiefs 14. During the Jets game, Gus kicked a record 12 field goals. The Minnesota Vikings game was such a triumph for the Atoms that Gus and Andy were carried off the field on the shoulders of their teammates, and later Gus was hoofing out autographs for the fans. Andy Petrovic had never dreamed of being on a TV show, especially a news special hosted by George Putnam, the famous American newscaster. Mr. Putnam looked into the TV camera. "Let us count our blessings," he began. "In a world sagging under many burdens, it is a wonderful thing to have as our guests Andy and Gus, our favorite, quote, American, unquote, athletes. The Atoms are now 10-1 and tied for first place in the Western Division, thanks to this great twosome. Gus is a winner. He's something we need in our daily lives. If he hadn't happened, we would have had to invent him." Sports fans all over the country nodded at their TV screens in agreement. Andy and Gus have helped create a cheerful feeling that has helped bring two great countries, America and Yugoslavia, together. And how would you like to meet the young man who has helped bring the people of these two great countries together? Putnam asked. "Ladies and gentlemen, our candidate for Goodwill Ambassador of the Year, trainer, and Gus's co-hero, Andy Petrovic." Andy appeared on the screen. He thanked the USA. He thanked the Atoms. He thanked Hank Cooper. "And most of all," he added nervously, "I would like to thank Gus." Gus, seated next to Andy, didn't miss this tribute, and neither did Mama and Papa Petrovic, seated in the living room of their farmhouse. They were watching their television set. "Remember," said the translator who sat with them, "I shall help put your words into American. All is in readiness here." He spoke into the microphone. They all looked back at the screen. Mr. Putnam was again speaking. "Andy, we have a surprise for you. Through the magic of Telstar, we are going to take you back to a small farm in Yugoslavia, where a proud family is waiting to be reunited with you. Come in, Yugoslavia!" Andy nearly fainted. There, before him, sat his parents. "Mama! Papa!" he gasped. "Andy, you are thin. Do not they feed you there?" his mother asked. Across two nations, split screens showed the two-way interview. "Believe me, Mrs. Petrovic, all America is in love with this boy," George Putnam was saying. "Nobody loves him as much as his mamma," Andy's mamma replied. "It must make you very proud to have a son who's a hero like Andy, Mr. Petrovic." George Putnam smiled. There was a sudden silence from Yugoslavia. "I don't think they heard that," Putnam said to a nearby TV director. Papa's voice came over loudly. "I can hear you." "Well, what do you think of this boy of yours?" Putnam asked. "He is a good boy, a good farmer. He has a nice butterfly collection." Andy began to fidget. "What will my papa say next?" He frowned worriedly. "But he's the toast of American football, Mr. Petrovic. To all of America he is a hero." There was another pause for the translator. Then Papa spoke. "I do not understand. What hero? The mule kicks and Andy holds the ball. A finger is a hero? You want to see a hero. I show you a hero." The next second, Stepan proudly stepped into the picture. "That is my brother, Stepan," Andy said weakly to Mr. Putnam. "Here you see the greatest soccer player in all of Europe," Papa Petrovic said, patting Stepan on the back. George Putnam smiled politely. "Fine, but this is a salute to Andy and Gus." Papa scowled. "Good. While you salute a finger, maybe also you should salute a hero. Yes?" The faint smile on Andy's face faded away. George Putnam spoke quickly. "Well, thank you for the visit, folks. What soccer is to the rest of the world, football is to America. We Americans can all pay tribute to these newly crowned American heroes tomorrow, for tomorrow is officially Gus Day." In their motel room, Spinner reached over and turned off the TV set. "I sure hate to ruin Gus Day for Gus," Crankcase sighed. "Don't worry," Spinner grinned. "He'll be a little sad. But think how happy we're going to be when that mule's knocked out." Gus usually enjoyed a cool swig of water and a few friendly pats from Andy and Debbie before he turned in for the night. But on the eve of Gus Day, he sensed something unhappy in the air. "Get a good night's sleep, Gus," Andy said sadly. "It's your day tomorrow. You must be at your best." "It'll be your day too, Andy," Debbie quickly said. Andy swung around. "Oh, Debbie, you heard my papa. It's Gus who really does everything. To papa I am nothing." "Andy, you don't really believe that, do you? Your father just doesn't understand." Andy sighed. "Papa understands. I understand, too." Gus shook his head and brayed. "That papa! He understands nothing. Debbie frowned. Andy, listen to me. You and Gus are a team. Don't you see? One could never be a hero without the other. Andy gave her a sad look. What is the use? And without even saying good night, he hurried out of the barn. Gus watched Debbie run after his friend. He blinked. Why doesn't he listen to her? She's right. We are a team. And if he keeps up this foolishness, Gus Day will be ruined for me. Chapter 8. Spinner and Crankcase arrived at the Lucum Ranch in plenty of time to go into action to put Gus out of action. Spinner, disguised as a Pemberton inspector, dropped off Crankcase at a hedge by the ranch property. He then drove on to the barn, where the guards were on duty. "It's a privilege to meet you, Inspector," the captain of the Pemberton Guards said. Spinner smiled and looked important. "Just want to be sure you boys are on your toes." "Oh, we're never off them, Inspector," the captain replied quickly. "We have Gus secured in his stable, ready for the big day." Spinner stopped smiling. "In his stable?" He pointed over to the ranch hedge in the distance. "Then how do you explain that?" Bobbing up and down on the far side of the hedge was a mule's head, ears wiggling back and forth. "Gus!" the Pemberton guard gasped. "Men!" he bawled out. "Quick!" Crankcase, bouncing a papier-mâché mule's head on the end of a broomstick, heard the guards come running. He zipped along the hedge, ducked through it to the ranch side, just as the guards crashed through to the far side. Then he sped back to Spinner's car. While all this was going on, Spinner lost no time in getting into the barn. "Gus," he grinned, "here's a little something extra for you. You're really going to celebrate Gus Day." Gus watched with interest as Spinner poured something into his water trough. "And here's another little extra," Spinner said as he poured something into Gus's oats. "There you go. Drink up. Eat up. Today's your day." Before Gus could even show appreciation, his well-wisher was gone. In only a few minutes, the Pemberton men came panting into the barn. "Look!" the guard captain shouted. "Gus! He was here all the time." "We were lured away!" another guard exclaimed. "You don't suppose that mule has been poisoned or something?" the third Pemberton man asked worriedly. Gus gave them a jolly hee-haw and added a wink. "He looks okay to me," the captain shrugged. "Probably the head office was just running a security test to make sure we were on our toes." "On our toes? We sure were on our toes. Man, mine are about worn out from chasing around that hedge." "Mine too," the captain agreed. "Well, boys, it won't be long before game time. We can get some rest at the stadium anyhow." All California seemed to have turned out for Gus Day. Celebrities from all over the area were on hand for the pre-game ceremonies. Every other fan was either wearing a Gus button, Gus ears, or, at the very least, waving an Atom pennant. A beautiful, huge floral horseshoe spelled out in white carnations, "California loves Gus." And over at the far end of the field, bales of hay formed the words G-U-S, D-A-Y. The announcer could hardly keep up with all he wanted to tell the TV fans across the country. "Listen to that roar, folks," he spoke into the mic. "It can mean only one thing. Here they come. Yes, folks, Gus and Andy are stepping out onto the special red carpet the atoms have rolled out for their stars. This must be the proudest moment of their lives." Andy walked ahead. He bowed shyly to the crowd. But behind him, Gus was making a dramatic entrance. There was nothing shy about Gus. He was weaving merrily from side to side of the red carpet, nodding his head in greeting to everybody. The crowd roared its approval. In fact, the roar was so strong that no one heard a lilting "Hee-haw! Yo-ho-ho!" and a bottle of oats. "That was some breakfast," he hiccuped, coming to a stop. "Don't know what I enjoyed most, the oats or the water." Andy looked around, puzzled. "Come on, Gus. We've got to get out to center field. The mayor himself is waiting for you." Gus gazed unsteadily out upon the gridiron. "This must be a pretty big town to have 4 mayors. Wish at least one of them would stand still." The announcer's voice came over the loudspeakers. "Well, the crowd belongs to Gus. It really is his day. Now the mayor is stepping forward to make the presentation of the floral horseshoe. Uh-oh, folks. That Gus is really a crowd pleaser. He's trying to kneel down at the mayor's feet." Down on the field, Andy begged Gus to behave. "Come on, Gus. Stop fooling around. Everybody waits. Come on. The mayor wants to give you something." Gus struggled to stay on his feet. The mayor held out the big horseshoe of flowers. A shocked look came over Gus's strangely blurred eyes. "A wreath? Who needs that? I'm not dead yet." "Uh-oh, folks," said the announcer. "Another slight delay. Gus has suddenly taken off and is romping around the field, and a half-dozen atoms are after him. I'll tell you this, the stadium is in an uproar. Are they going to catch him? I don't think so. Gus is zigging and zagging in and out. What a broken field runner he could be." "Gus!" Andy shouted. Gus looked around, doubled back, then whizzed past Andy and the others. "Hold everything, folks." The announcer's voice was filled with excitement. "Gus is heading full steam for the mayor and the other dignitaries here today." Gus, in an easy, fast lope, aimed straight for the mayor. "4 of everybody is here," he muttered. "This is too much." "It's 4 much," Gus muttered. He gathered speed. Celebrities scattered. But Gus, like a back rambling through a big hole in the line, went romping on his way. "Shades of Larry Zonka!" the announcer exclaimed. "The way Gus barreled through that line, it looks like he's switched from place kicker to fullback. Well, Andy's finally corralled him. He's leading Gus back to the mayor in center field." Nobody could say that the mayor wasn't brave. He lifted the horseshoe high over Gus's head. Gus ducked, dove his head down between the mayor's ankles. Instantly the mayor was neatly hoisted up on Gus's back. Off they went, mayor, carnations, Gus, at a fast gallop. On the sidelines, Hank Cooper couldn't look. His hands went over his eyes. "He's heading straight for the Atomet's pyramid," he gasped. Without slowing down, Gus bounced the mayor and a few hundred white carnations onto the platform, holding the tottering Atomets. "Gus!" Andy groaned. as the tottering pyramid came tumbling down. What a pre-game ceremony! There had never been anything like it in the history of any sports arena, and still a big game between the Adams and the Philadelphia Eagles was coming up for the excited fans. For Hank Cooper, the game couldn't start soon enough. He breathed a sigh of exhaustion when the two teams finally trotted out on the field and the announcer said, "Well, folks, the Eagles have won the toss and Gus will kick off. If he plays with half the spirit he's been showing, Eagles, watch out." Andy, as usual, bent to hold the ball. "Hoop!" he yelled. Gus swayed. "Did I hear somebody say hoop?" he wondered fuzzily. "I'd better sit down and figure this out." Andy ducked back just in time. Gus's rump landed weightily on the football. Bang! Whoosh! Shh! "They're gonna need another ball, folks," the announcer warned. "Nothing left of that one but leather. I tell you, this isn't the Gus we're used to seeing." In despair, Andy led Gus to the sideline where Doc Morgan was waiting. The old vet checked Gus's eyes and mouth. He didn't bother to get out his stethoscope. "What's wrong, Doc?" Hank asked anxiously. Doc Morgan shook his head. "Hank, I can tell you this. If Gus was on a highway right now, he'd be arrested for drunk driving." "What?" Hank exploded. "Blithered," Doc replied sadly. Gus moaned. "I'll never eat another oat as long as I live, and that may be only a few hours." At the end of Gus Day, the Eagles walked away with the game, and Gus walked away with an ice bag on his aching head. The next Sunday, Charlie Gwynn, Cal Wilson, his lawyer, and Spinner and Crankcase were listening to the sportscaster's report of the Buffalo Atom game. "Well, the Atoms really showed 'em how it's done here in Buffalo, folks," he said. "It was the Bills against Gus, and Gus came out on top today, 30-27. That moves the California club into a first-place tie with the Rams, who lost today. And it sets up the really big one for next week, when the Atoms play those same Los Angeles Rams." Charlie Gwynn snapped off the TV. "We got to stop that mule," he rasped. He glared at Cal, Spinner, and Crankcase. "If those Atoms make the Super Bowl, I lose. And if I lose, you lose. 25 grand, and don't you forget it." Spinner yawned. "Relax, Mr. Gwynn. We're not going to lose that kind of dough. Don't worry." Debbie met the returning Atoms at the airport. She gave Gus a big hug and gave Andy a quick kiss. But it wasn't quick enough for Rob Cargill not to see. The charging linebacker nearly charged Andy then and there. By the next day on the practice field, Rob's fury had grown to mountain size. When Andy yelled, "Hoop!" Gus's hooves lifted and Rob charged across the line of scrimmage. It was a mistake. Up went the football, followed by Rob's helmet, shoulder pads, pants, and jersey. The Atoms' star linebacker went off to the hospital. "I can't stand it," Hank Cooper raged. "Why am I the only guy whose team won't act like a team? And now Rob's talking about going to the Michigan Mammoths." "At least he can talk, Mr. Cooper," Debbie said. "That's something." Hank sighed. "I guess so, but we've got the divisional title game coming up." He shook his head. "Andy and Gus will win it for you, Mr. Cooper. I just know they will," Debbie replied earnestly. Chapter 9. On the day of the game against the Los Angeles Rams, Gus and Andy were in great spirits. Gus, in particular, felt good after 2 weeks' diet of plain, unflavored oats, hay, and water. He had a hunch that he was going to make Mr. Cooper proud of him once more. "You look great, Gus," Andy patted him. "After what you did to Rob, that's going to mean a lot to—" The ring of the barn telephone sounded sharply. "Excuse me, Gus. I'll get it," Andy said. Gus listened. He saw Andy's face go pale. "Memorial Hospital? What's happened to Debbie?" At the other end of the line, Spinner, disguising his voice again, was saying, "This is Dr. Ernest Goldman speaking. There's been an accident, a 2-car collision, but don't worry, she's in good hands. She says you're not to think about her. She knows you have an important game today, and she doesn't want you to miss it." Andy clenched the phone. "Where is this hospital?" "You're not to come down here, sir," Spinner replied. "How do I find the hospital?" Andy almost shouted. Spinner grinned and winked at Crankcase. "It's a long way from where you are, sir, but if you insist—" "I do," Andy said firmly. Spinner gave him directions. "You can't miss it. It's a 12-story building. But one thing, not a word to anyone about this. We haven't notified her parents yet. I'll meet you in the lobby." "I'll be right there." Andy slammed down the phone and bolted out the door. "See you later, Gus," he called over his shoulder. Spinner, wearing a doctor's operating garb and carrying large X-ray films in his hand, met Andy as he'd promised. "Mr. Petrovic? Dr. Goldman?" Spinner nodded. "Right this way, sir." He guided Andy into an elevator. As they stepped out on the 7th floor, Crankcase, also dressed as a doctor, and with a surgical mask hiding his face, met them. "The room is ready, Dr. Goldman," he said. "Follow me." "Thank you, doctor." The two, quote, "doctors," unquote, hustled Andy down a long hallway and into one of the private rooms. Andy stared. "Where's Debbie?" "She'll be fine, but right now she needs a blood transfusion. What type blood do you have?" Spinner asked. "I'm not sure," Andy replied worriedly. Crankcase waved a hand. "Whatever kind it is, that's the kind she needs." Spinner handed Andy a hospital gown. "Just change into this, sir, so you'll be ready for the transfusion." "Of course." Andy snatched off his jacket and began unbuttoning his shirt. "We'll be right back," said Dr. Goldman. "You just lie down on that bed and relax." Hank Cooper wondered if he'd ever see a game day that didn't bring him a terrible headache. He paced up and down. "Don't you even know where Andy went?" he yelled at the Pemberton guards. "Mr. Cooper, we just saw him leave." "He was in a big hurry. We thought he'd be here by now." You thought! Hank raged, pacing up and down the Adams locker room. He'd have paced right out of it if he'd known where Andy was that minute. Andy was growing more and more restless as he waited in the small hospital room. When the door finally opened, he almost leaped off the bed. "How is Debbie?" he begged. I've been waiting for the transfusion, but no one has come in." Spinner patted Andy's shoulder. "Patience, my boy. Everything's going along fine. She sent you a message. 'Just knowing you're here eases the pain,' she said." Andy could feel tears sting his eyes. "If I could only see her." "Relax, son," the good, quote, doctor, unquote, replied. "You don't want to get all excited. You'll get your blood all bubbly, and that would be bad for the transfusion." He picked up the clothes Andy had heaped on the end of the bed. "Now I'll just take these. Be patient. This will all be over soon." But at the end of 10 long minutes, Andy could stand the mysterious delay no longer. "I must find out what is wrong." He went out the door and looked out. No one was in sight, not even at the nurse's desk a short way down the hall. Andy hesitated. Then, noticing the telephone on the desk, he suddenly thought about the game for the first time since he'd left the ranch. "I must call Mr. Cooper. Oh, it is terrible what is happening. Poor Debbie! Poor Mr. Cooper! But I cannot be in 2 places at once." The Atoms were already warming up on the sidelines when Joe Barnsdale rushed up with the news. "I just heard from Andy, Mr. Cooper." "Where is he?" Hank shouted. "There's been an emergency. He'll be here as soon as he gives Debbie a transfusion." "Debbie? A transfusion?" Hank waved his arm wildly. "Does that girl over there look as though she needs a transfusion? I need the transfusion. What are you talking about?" Joe stared. There stood Debbie, stroking Gus's neck. "But that's what he said, Mr. Cooper. He said Debbie was in the hospital." "What hospital?" Hank demanded. Joe shook his head. "He didn't say." Hank exploded. "Then find out," he yelled. "Call every hospital in town." Andy no sooner put down the phone than a nurse strode up to him. "Something I can do for you?" she asked. "I've been waiting for my doctors," Andy explained. "I have to give a blood transfusion, then hurry to a football game." "Oh? What room are you in?" The nurse looked puzzled. Before Andy could explain further, Crankcase appeared, still dressed in a doctor's operating gown and mask. He began pulling Andy along the hall. "I know who you think you are," Crankcase said. He winked at the nurse who was following them. "Now just you go into this nice room here. I'll have your mule sent up to you. Number 703. Okay?" Crankcase grinned and began to close the door. Andy tugged it back. "I don't think you believe me," he said. "Sure we do," Crankcase answered. "We'd believe you if you said you were Wilt Chamberlain, Billy Graham, or Snow White and the 7 Dwarfs." He pushed Andy back and started to close the door again. Andy heard him say to the nurse, "I'll take care of him. He may be dangerous." "Then he doesn't belong in 703, the nurse replied. "He belongs in L-16. You stay here and I'll go check." The door closed. Andy stared at it in shock and horror. "This must be a bad dream," he gasped. Crankcase, standing guard at the door, heard the scream. It started loud and shrill, then grew fainter until it faded away altogether. It sounded just the way Andy wanted it to, like someone taking a high dive out of a tall building. In panic, Crankcase threw himself into the room, He raced over to the open window and leaned out. Andy came rapidly from behind the door and closed the window on crankcase. He trapped the quote doctor unquote half in and half out of the window. "Pardon me, I'm sorry," Andy said. Then he went out of the room and closed the door. Andy took one quick, wild look down the hall. Luck was with him. The nurse who had gone to check on L-16 hadn't returned. There was a different nurse at the desk. Andy hurried down the hall. "Excuse," he said. "Can you tell me in which room I'll find Miss Debbie Kovac? She is a friend of mine, and I heard she was in an accident." The nurse looked sympathetic. "I don't believe we have a patient by that name on this floor. Wait, I'll check the admitting office for you." Andy waited, heart in mouth. "No, we have no one by that name here," the nurse said, putting down the phone. "Thank you. Perhaps I have the wrong hospital," Andy piped. He turned then and saw Spinner heading for him. Andy took off down the corridor. "I must get out of here," he gasped. After a detour through the X-ray room and a chase down half the hospital corridors, Andy finally escaped from doctors, Spinner, and crankcase. Hank Cooper sat on the bench with his head in his hands. "I've heard of a one-man dog, but how could I wind up with a one-man mule? Gus won't kick for anyone. We're sunk." Debbie tried to sound hopeful. "There's still a chance, Mr. Cooper. There's a whole quarter left." "Debbie, there could be 2 weeks left, but without Andy holding the ball, we're dead." It looked as though Hank was right when the clock showed 18 seconds left in the last quarter. On the giant scoreboard was the score: Atoms 12, Rams 14. The announcer's voice was doom in Hank's ears. "Well, folks, any dreams the Atoms had of going to the Super Bowl have vanished along with their little place kick holder, Andy. With 18 seconds to go, it's the Atoms' ball on their own 35. Usually an automatic field goal for Gus. But Gus refuses to kick for anyone but Andy." Coach Venner looked beaten. "Well, we got Gus out there. The question is, who are we gonna send out there with him?" Suddenly, a roar went up in the stands. Hank and the coach looked around. There, coming out of the tunnel entrance, was Number 0! The Atom players cheered. Gus wiggled his ears happily. "Come on, hero," he winked. "We almost lost it this time." Unnoticed by anyone, Andy, still clad in a hospital gown, rushed up inside the tunnel entrance. No one heard his amazed gasp as from out on the field, Number 0 shouted, "Hoop!" Gus made it straight and true for 3 points. The crowd went wild. The Atoms had won it again. As the team came running off the field, they brushed joyfully by Andy. Gus trotted into the tunnel, as happy as the others, until he suddenly spotted the white-clad figure. "Whoa!" he exclaimed, more or less to himself. An Atom teammate socked Number 0 on the back. "Way to go, Andy!" he yelled. The force of that wallop knocked Number 0's helmet off. There stood Debbie! Andy stared. Debbie stared. It was Andy who spoke first. "My papa was right," he said slowly. I am some hero when even a girl can take my place. Quickly he turned on his bare heels. He hurried off before Debbie could speak. Hank Cooper and Debbie watched the 6 o'clock news and sports cast on the small TV set that had been placed in the barn for Andy's use. Gus, taking no interest, was lying down in his stall looking mournfully at old Doc Morgan. An interesting sidelight to the Atom's phenomenal win today was Andy's disappearance, the sportscaster said. Not only was he not there during most of the game, but immediately following it, he disappeared. He didn't shower, and he didn't show up for the post-game show. The sportscaster smiled into the camera. Can it be that Andy is out doing a little celebrating? Debbie reached over and turned off the set. One thing he isn't doing is celebrating, she said grimly. Doc Morgan came out of Gus's stall. If Gus was my old Aunt Hattie, I'd call this a case of the vapors. Come to think of it, though, I don't remember ever having to carry Aunt Hattie out of a horse trailer. Nothing's wrong with that mule, Hank. Debbie sighed. I have a feeling that if Andy walked through the door this minute, the vapors would disappear. Gus is probably more worried than any of us. Not any more worried than I am, Hank growled. Where does a Yugoslavian kid go to drown his sorrows? Debbie jumped up. I think I know. She hurried toward the door. See you later, Mr. Cooper. Chapter 10. Flight 437 for New York, London, Belgrade, now boarding at Gate 7. All aboard, please. Andy picked up his luggage and started, along with other passengers, for the gate. As they neared the tunnel leading to the plane, the airline steward looked up from his clipboard and recognized Andy. Hey, I was at the game today. Great win, Andy. Before Andy could say a word, he was surrounded with fans from the passenger line, all wanting autographs. Going to New York? Asked one passenger. No, back to Yugoslavia. What about the playoffs and the Super Bowl? Another called out. Andy hesitated. Gus will do very well without me. No, he won't, a familiar voice rang out. Nor will an awful lot of other people. Debbie. Debbie hurried up. Andy, I have to talk with you. Now. Andy didn't budge. I must go back, Debbie. Okay, so you must go back, and I must talk with you first, okay? She tugged his arm and led him back a distance from the curious bystanders. Debbie, before you start, I know that my papa was right. I was never really a player, if it weren't for Gus. Your papa! Your papa! Debbie exclaimed. Andy, don't you understand? It's not your papa. It's you. You have to be something in your own eyes before you can be anything to anybody else. Andy shrugged. Sure. In the meantime, my brother Stjepan is the hero. Debbie blazed. Hero? Who cares if you're a hero if you aren't man enough to stay and fight for something you care about? She gave him a little push. Oh, go to Yugoslavia. Run. You'll be proving that 0 on your uniform is right. When the steward touched his arm, Andy was still staring back toward the terminal, even though Debbie had been out of sight a full minute. Boarding time, Mr. Petrovic. Hank Cooper nearly jerked the telephone out of its connection. To Yugoslavia? You told him off? Debbie, couldn't you just stop him? She did, Mr. Cooper, Andy said quietly, stepping into the room. Hank, so excited by Andy's disappearance that he couldn't believe in his reappearance, kept right on shouting into the phone. The mule's nothing without him. Nothing. Once he's on that plane. But I am not on that plane, Andy said loudly. Hank looked around. He put down the phone. Where have you been? He exploded. No, never mind telling me where you've been. I'll tell you where you're going to be from now on. You're going to go into hiding. You and Gus. Andy, nobody is going to know where you're staying until after the Super Bowl game, if we get to it. Not even Debbie? Andy asked, shocked. Not even nobody. It's the Dolphins in Miami next week, and I'm keeping my eye on you and Gus for just as long as it takes to get to that bowl game. To Charlie Gwynn's despair, the Adams star place kicker romped through the Dolphin game, kicking 14 field goals to take the win from Miami. If there's one thing I can't stand, it's losing, he said angrily. Some help your friends have been, Cal. If those two Yugoslavians get to the Super Bowl, it's all over. Cal shook his head. If we could only find out where they're being kept. I've called all my connections. No luck. Nothing. They gotta be somewhere, Charlie Gwynn glowered. Cal sighed. Too bad Rob Cargill's accident didn't happen to Andy. It took Cargill out of that game and sent him to the Michigan Mammoths, splints and all. Charlie Gwynn shook his head. A little love triangle, including Debbie and Andy, is what really ruined Cargill. Yeah, Cal nodded. Guess that's right. He suddenly jumped up. Say, Charlie, Andy probably talks on the phone to that girl. So? Cal grinned. So it's simple. We bug her phone and we find out where the Yugoslavians are holed up. Get it? He hurried to the telephone. Might just as well get a little action going now. What are you planning? Charlie Gwynn asked. You'll hear it on the sports news tonight, Charlie. Cal grinned. I think your worries are going to be over very, very soon. The evening sports news did nothing for Andy Petrovic's peace of mind. He could hardly believe his ears. There was the sportscaster, smiling broadly and saying, Well, romance has come into the sports news. We get it from a reliable source that in the glow of the Super Bowl game, linebacker Rob Cargill, though he left the Atoms for the Michigan Mammoths, left his heart in California. He and Debbie Kovac, the Atoms Girl Friday, have announced their engagement. Andy nearly flew into the TV set, changed his mind at the last second, and flew to the telephone instead. It didn't take more than a few words from Debbie for Andy to learn she intended to set the sportscaster straight on his news items. And in the same short time, the tiny microphone hidden in Debbie's lampshade picked up the same news for the ears of Spinner and Crankcase. Andy, I really miss you, Debbie's voice sounded clearly. We miss you too, Spinner muttered. Wish they'd say something useful. Crankcase held up his hand. Listen! "You'd love it here, Debbie," Auntie's voice came over. "When you climb to the top of the mountain, you can see the ocean." Spinner grinned and held up his fingers in the A-OK signal. "We got it, Crankcase. Now let's pass the word to Cal and Charlie Gwynn." Charlie Gwynn frowned. "He can see the ocean?" "Sure he can see it. Why didn't I think of that place before? Hank Cooper has a cabin in the Malibu Mountains in L.A. If I were a betting man, Cal, I'd take a look up there." By the time the weekend arrived, Spinner and Crankcase were all set to earn their promised $25,000. "This time nothing goes wrong," Crankcase said gleefully. "That was a great idea of yours, Spinner, dressing up like a scoutmaster and getting this Camp Kaiwani bus." He burst out laughing. You a scoutmaster? And that fake mustache? He'll never recognize you." "And a scoutmaster getting a fake Gus with a paint job," Spinner agreed modestly. "Don't forget that part, Crankcase. Nobody could tell them apart until the phony Gus is brought in to kick a field goal. Then, ouch!" Crankcase giggled. "Now remember," Spinner went on, "I block the mountain road with the bus. Then when they start down with Gus in the horse trailer, I say, 'Can you please help me?' Naturally, they're going to say yes, because I've got the road blocked anyhow. And while all of you are getting Camp Kaiwani out of trouble, I get Gus in trouble," Crankcase cackled. "I just switch mules, neat as you please. Off they go with Gus number 2, and off we go with Gus 00. If Gus hadn't been in the middle of a nap, things might not have gone so well for Spinner and Crankcase. But when Crankcase opened the horse trailer, Gus looked around wearily. "No, you're not looking in the mirror, Gus. Just at a great paint job. Out you go. We're playing a little game of musical mules." Gus stepped out grumpily. "In and out and in. I may not look it, but I need my beauty rest, same as anybody." Except for the desk clerk, the motel lobby was deserted when Spinner came in. "Yes, sir," the clerk smiled. "I can give you room 319, 2 double beds. The elevators are just around the corner." Spinner couldn't have been more pleased. That solved the problem of getting Gus up to the 3rd floor. Now to get him into the motel. As Spinner leaned over to sign the register, he suddenly slapped his hands over his eyes. "Contact lens!" he exclaimed to the startled desk clerk. "Always dropping out." "Let me help. I've got 20/20 vision," said the desk clerk proudly. To Spinner's pleasure, the other man got down on all fours to search. Crankcase, on Spinner's signal, hurried Gus through the carpeted lobby to the elevator. Thus Gus made his entrance as a motel guest unnoticed by anyone. Spinner stayed with the desk clerk long enough to make the search look authentic. "Got it!" he exclaimed finally, holding his fingers a 1/4 inch apart as though he were balancing a contact lens between them. "I don't see it," the clerk said, leaning forward. "You'd better have those eyes checked," Spinner warned. "You need this worse than I do." Except for a small adventure on the way to the 3rd floor, all went well. But for a moment Spinner was breathless when a dignified couple joined them in the elevator. It was all he could do to keep them from noticing Gus, especially as Gus promptly began to nibble the lady's flowered hat. When the couple stepped out on the second floor, Gus kept his hold on the flowers. Off came the hat, and a wig! The doors slid shut, suddenly closing off the view of the startled, wigless motel guest, and of Gus, chewing happily on her hat, never too tired for a little snack. In the bedroom, Crankcase began to worry. "Everything's gone all right so far, Spinner, but I still think we should have taken this mule out of state. It was crazy staying here so close to the bowl game." "Aw, go to sleep," Spinner replied. "We'll leave right after the game tomorrow." Crankcase switched off the light. "Spinner!" he gasped. "Someone's getting in my bed with me!" He reached for the light and snapped it on. "The mule!" "Well, he's got to sleep somewhere, doesn't he?" Spinner said crossly. "Go to sleep." "But why with me?" Crankcase asked unhappily. "Why me, Spinner?" Spinner rolled over. "How do I know? Maybe you remind him of his mother. Now let's get some sleep around here." Chapter 11. The sun wasn't shining for the Super Bowl game, but Hank Cooper hardly missed it. "For the first time since I can remember, I don't have a headache," he told Andy as they walked into the Adams locker room. "Gus looks good, doesn't he, Mr. Cooper?" Andy beamed. "How'd he sleep?" Hank asked. "Never better." Andy hesitated. "He looks good, but you know something? He looks like he's put on a few pounds, almost overnight." Hank laughed. "As far as I'm concerned, he can look like a whale, as long as he doesn't go out there and kick like one." Maybe he was just enjoying his rub down so much that he didn't feel like wiggling his ears, Andy said. But it's the first time he hasn't bothered with even a "good morning" to me. Oh well, this is the big day. Maybe he's nervous. Far from the Atoms locker room at the Coliseum, the real Gus was missing his morning rub-down, but Spinner was at least giving him a drink of water from the sink. Crankcase, at the phone, had his mind on breakfast for 3. "Room service?" he asked. "We'd like 2 large orange juices, 2 toasts, rye and whole wheat, 1 scrambled egg with bacon, and 1 fried egg with sausage." He paused and looked over at Gus, then back at the phone. "Say, you got any Quaker oats? Good. Send up a bucket. Raw." Drifting through the misty skies over the Coliseum, the Goodyear blimp helped welcome the fans to the Super Bowl game. There was a feeling of excitement in the air, even though the flags around the stadium hung damply with scarcely a flutter. In the announcer's booth, Pepper Allen and John Unitas were ready for the big game to get underway. "Well, John," said Pepper Allen, "here we are in the City of the Angels, Super Bowl Sunday, when the amazing Wonder Team with the Miracle Mule, the California Atoms, meets the nemesis of the National Football League, the Michigan Mammoths, for the championship of the football world." He looked out upon the cloudy, damp skies. "I have it on good authority, ladies and gentlemen, that the chances for sunshine are practically nil." John Unitas shook his head. I don't know about that, Pepper. I think the sun's coming out. So it is, Pepper agreed. The sun apparently has decided to join us, but the field, by now a muddy quagmire, is still an atom field. We have seen time and again that mud portends a rash of turnovers, and you and I know what turnovers mean to those atoms. They have lived by the turnover all year long. The question is, will they live or die by them today? While you're working on the answer, Pepper, John grinned, we've got some guests from overseas whom we'd better introduce. Indeed we must, John. Flown in all the way from Yugoslavia, Mama and Papa Petrovic. The cameras turned to Andy's parents and their translator sitting stiffly nearby. Mama and Papa, Pepper began, what a thrill it must be for you to be here to see your hero son perform today. Papa listened to the translator, then frowned. We see hero son perform yesterday. He wins soccer match for Yugoslavia against Chicago Boilermakers. Mama nudged her husband. Papa, they talk about Andy. Oh, Andy. A good boy. Good farmer. Goats and pigs not the same since he left. Pepper looked uneasy. Mr. Petrovic, we are alluding to a genuine American hero. Papa sighed. Ah, the finger again. A man who holds the ball for a mule to kick? We will see. Pepper quickly moved the mic away and looked back on the field. Indeed, we will all see. The teams are coming onto the rain-soaked field. One final word, ladies and gentlemen. We mentioned that a personal drama will be played out today on the field below. Rob Cargill, late of the Atoms and now with the Michigan Club, is on the bench, splints and all, ready to play if needed. And now for the game, John Unitas said. Crankcase put down his coffee cup and looked at his watch. What do you know? We must have slept late, Spinner. It's about game time. He got up and turned on the color TV set. John Unitas smiled out from the screen. We're about ready for the kickoff, folks. The cameras shifted to Pepper Allen. Right you are, John. And I want you to note this, ladies and gentlemen. Most kickers kick out of a small receptacle called a tee, but not Gus. At the sound of his name, Gus glanced over at the screen and looked Pepper Allen in the eye. Gus will kick only for Andy, Allen was saying. He and the boy are inseparable. They are a pair. Where one is, so is the other. Gus edged closer to Pepper. That fellow doesn't know what he's talking about. Haven't seen Andy since I got up this morning. He eyed the screen sharply. Of all things, there's Andy, but who's that mule he's holding for? Allen's voice came on again. Well, here comes the kickoff. Are you ready, Gus? Andy called out. The Gus on the field took this dramatic moment to lower his head and munch some Coliseum grass. The Gus in the motel room wiggled his ears, backed himself up to the TV set, and waited for Andy's whoop. Bam! The set batted up over and crashed against the wall as Spinner and Crankcase dived for the beds. That mule's gone ape, crankcase quivered. "What's he doing?" Spinner took one horrified look at the shattered set, the broken plaster, and at Gus clomping energetically around the room. "Whatever it is, stay away from those hind legs, unless you want to look like that TV set," he gasped. Gus took one more fast clop around, then backed up to the hall door. He eyed Spinner and crankcase. "Well, hate to eat and run, but I'd better get over to the Coliseum. Late already." Wham! Out flew the door in splinters. Motel guests who had gathered outside to find out what was going on in room 319 scattered wildly as Gus trotted out. He briskly galloped down the hallway, Spinner and crankcase following at a safe distance. Too safe! Gus was on and off a handy elevator, into the lobby and out the front door before the two mule nappers could lay a halter on him. Hank Cooper and Coach Venner stared at the Adams' great place kicker contentedly munching grass. Even from the distance of the sidelines they could hear Andy's anxious voice. But the mule didn't even bother to wiggle his ears in reply. Hank jumped to his feet, fuming with anger. "What's going on out there? What's he trying to do to me? He's never... Look! Andy rubbed the color right off that mule's nose." Coach Venner looked. "Because the field's so wet, Mr. Cooper," he said cheerfully. "Nothing to worry about. We just got a mule with a paint job, that's all." "It isn't even Gus, you nincompoop!" Hank exploded. Mama and Papa Petrovic, now seated on the sidelines bench, were huddled close together. "Here comes Andy," Mama Petrovic said. "He does not look happy." Andy joined his parents at the end of the bench. "Let me see if I understand game, Andy," said his father. "Mammoths 21, atoms 0. That is good?" "That is very bad, Papa." "Then when does famous finger go into game?" Andy flushed. "Without Gus, Papa, maybe never." Papa looked at Mama. He sighed. "It was long trip, but anyhow, Boilermaker's game was nice." Pepper Allen kept fans across the entire country informed on what was not going on at the Coliseum. "It's almost halftime," he announced, "and the long-anticipated Super Bowl showdown has turned into a laugher for the Mammoths. But I assure you there are very few of the 90,000 fans packed in the Coliseum who are laughing. For it is a day that will live in infamy. A fraud has been perpetrated on the American public. They expected to see the miracle mule, Gus. What they have seen is an impostor, a fraud, a fake, a phony. Where or for what reason Gus is now missing, we may never know." John Unitas interrupted. "Pepper, just got it over my earphones. A mule's been spotted not far from a shopping center in the valley. Might be Gus." Pepper laughed. "I think not, John. There's no way that could be Gus. No way." John Unitas leaned forward. "Excuse me, Pepper. I just got an update on that bulletin. From the description and markings, that mule has definitely been identified as Gus." Pepper beamed as happily as though he had predicted the bulletin. "There's no question about it, ladies and gentlemen. That mule in the valley is definitely our Gus." Down on the sidelines, Hank Cooper was getting an even later bulletin from Joe Barnsdale. "He's somewhere out near Topanga Canyon, Mr. Cooper, but they've lost him." Hank whipped over to Andy and grabbed him by the arm. "Let's go, kid." "Where are we going, Mr. Cooper?" "How do I know?" Hank exclaimed. "We're gonna find Gus, that's all. And if we don't, nobody better find the two of us. 90,000 fans here, and all enemies. Come on!" Chapter 12. With Spinner and Crankcase hot on his trail, Gus made it through the pass, the pedestrian underpass, that led straight into the Tobanga Canyon shopping center, where Hank and Andy spied him from the helicopter. Gus galloped onward, and the doors of a large supermarket swung open magically and swiftly in welcome. With equal swiftness, a customer with an armload of groceries moved to one side. Gus missed her. But, alas, Spinner and Crankcase barreled into her and sent the bundles flying. There was no time to wonder how the pair had trailed him so quickly. Gus bolted down one of the aisles, turned the corner, and grazed a beautiful tower-like display of canned vegetables. It tilted like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, then came crashing down. Spinner and Crankcase, romping after Gus, stumbled over the cans like two fugitives from a log-rolling contest. Whiz! Gus bounded quickly into the next aisle. At the end was a large display of fresh red tomatoes. From the corner of his eye, Gus could see Crankcase getting ready to leap at him. Gus came to a full stop, sending Crankcase sailing into the fresh, juicy tomatoes. Gus hee-hawed in satisfaction as he moved on down the next aisle, and the next. In every one, pursued by Spinner and Crankcase, he left a trail of broken bottles, smashed cans, and broken boxes. "No mule's gonna outsmart us," Spinner declared, picking himself up off the floor once again. "He's done a pretty good job of it so far," Crankcase pointed out. "Look, this store's as good as any corral. You round him up, and I'll lasso him. Think you can handle that?" Spinner asked, taking a rope down from the hardware display. "You kidding?" Crankcase boomed. "I was a busboy on a dude ranch once." Gus was just then pacing past the meat counter, where the butcher was talking to one of his customers. "Oh, yes," the butcher said. "We package it all ourselves. That's how we built our reputation for having the freshest meat in town." "I see," exclaimed the customer, staring at Gus. "I don't think you do," said the butcher. Gus threw them both a wide smile. The customer threw down the package of meat and marched off. Exhausted, Spinner and Crankcase came to rest against the bakery shelf. "Which way did he go?" Spinner asked. "I don't know, but I'd settle for going back to jail," Crankcase puffed. "Not with 25 G's at stake. You go that way. Drive him down here. I'll climb up on the shelf and lasso him when he goes by." Spinner finally dropped his lasso on Gus, and for that he was thrown headlong into a gigantic white cake and dumped into a tank of live lobsters. Having totaled Spinner and Crankcase, not to mention the store, Gus loped out the automatic doors into the parking lot. Andy and Hank Cooper and the helicopter were waiting. Hank had to interrupt the happy reunion between Gus and Andy. "Now to get him from the supermarket to the Super Bowl," he urged. Pepper Allen was first to tell the world. Yes, Gus has been found, ladies and gentlemen, and the culprits who kidnapped him have been apprehended. But it's a long, long way from Topanga Canyon to the Coliseum, and there's no way they can get Gus here in time for the last half of the game. Pepper, John Unitas said, there may be one way. There is no way, John, Pepper replied sternly. He looked off in the direction John was staring. No way but one, Pepper added sweetly. A helicopter was fluttering down into the Coliseum. Suspended from it by a heavy harness was Gus. The crowd roared with excitement. There was an official timeout as Gus was unharnessed by his happy fellow atoms. Debbie was so excited that she rushed out on the field and gave Andy a huge hug and kiss. Over on the mammoth bench, Rob Cargill glared furiously at that tender scene. "Am I going to get that guy?" he grated out. "Am I?" With only 2 minutes remaining in the last quarter, Pepper Allen was almost hysterical. The louder the crowd roared, the hoarser his voice became, and now it was down to a mere croak. "Unbelievable! Incredible! Totally without precedent, ladies and gentlemen. 2 minutes remaining, and Gus has almost turned the game around. 9 consecutive field goals, but..." He frantically pointed to his hoarse throat, and John Unitas took over. "If we don't see a miracle on the field, folks, we've certainly been treated to one here in the booth. Pepper's voice has given out. What Pepper no doubt wants to say is..." He grinned and began speaking Allen style. "In a comeback unparalleled in the annals of football, Andy and Gus have captured the hearts of every Homo sapiens in this delirious throng, and I say this in all humility, your humble servant. But bear this in mind, if you will. A comeback does not a victory make." Grinning broadly, he looked at his fellow announcer. "How was that, Pepper?" Coach Venner smiled merrily at the Atom's owner. "We can still do it! Only 1 point, Mr. Cooper. 28-27. Hank nearly pushed his cheerful head coach over. "With 20 seconds left, and them with the ball?" Coach Venner frowned slightly. "That does cut down the odds a little," he admitted. On the field, a mammoth fullback rambled about 10 yards through the drizzle and mud and came to a squashing halt on the Atom's 2-yard line. A timeout was called. Up in the stands, Charlie Gwynn and Cal Wilson looked on happily. "I think you won yourself a ball team, Charlie," Cal grinned. Charlie Gwynn nodded. "And the first thing you're gonna do is get that mule's hoofprint on a contract," he chuckled. "Look down there at Hank. There's a man with a broken heart." Now, with only 10 seconds left on the clock, Hank Cooper was too numb to know if his heart was broken or not. As usual, Coach Venner tried to say something encouraging. "Losing by 1 point isn't too bad at all, Mr. Cooper. It's something to be proud of." Hank almost lifted his head coach off the ground. "Don't you understand?" he bellowed. "I've just lost a team." Coach Venner thought a second. "Well, then it's something for the next owner to be proud of." All Hank could do was shut his eyes. It was too late to cover his ears. On the bench, Debbie tried to cheer a downcast Andy. "You and Gus have come so close, Andy. I'm sure your papa realizes that. He must be proud of you now." "It isn't Papa I'm worried about," Andy said unhappily. "To him I'll always be half a hero. It's Mr. Cooper. I'm sorry we couldn't win it for him." Timeout over, the two teams lined up. Coach Venner looked over at Hank. "Well, here they go, Mr. Cooper." "I can't look," Hank choked. "I won't either, then," Coach Venner replied soothingly. But as he closed his eyes, Hank opened his. A mammoth fullback carried the ball into the center line. The ball squirted into the air. Plop! Down it went, into the hands of an atom player, quickly downed on his own goal line. "A fumble!" Hank bellowed. There was a thunderous roar from the stands, and every atom player on the bench jumped up. Andy and Gus rushed over to Hank and the coach. "Punt? Or do we go in, Mr. Cooper?" Andy asked breathlessly. Hank nodded. "Okay, kid. You and Gus get in there and do your stuff." "We'll have to kick from the end zone, Mr. Cooper, and Gus isn't too accurate over 100 yards. Hank patted Andy's shoulder. "Just relax, kid. Be calm. Don't think about a thing. Just that an old man's life or death depends on this kick." Andy gulped and headed out onto the field with Gus. Debbie joined Mama and Papa Petrovic. "Now you can watch Andy become a real hero." Papa shrugged. "But only if the mule kicks the ball. That's half a hero." Coach Venner, his eyes on the field, suddenly gasped. "Holy Toledo, Mr. Cooper! Look who's coming in!" Rob Cargill, splints and all, was storming out onto the field. As the teams lined up, Rob took his position as middle linebacker. Andy, one knee in the mud, looked up at Cargill. "While you're down there, say a little prayer, runt," Rob rasped. "'Cause when that ball's snapped, I'm turning that spot into a Yugoslavian burial ground." Andy only turned his head toward Gus. "We've come this far, Gus. Now we're going all the way." He signaled for the ball. "Ready, Gus?" Gus wagged his ears. "Whoop!" Gus seemed to gather himself for the mightiest kick of his life. Ploosh! Flood! He was down in the mud, missing the ball completely. In a split second, Rob crashed through and blasted into Andy. The ball squirted loose in the end zone. Rob went after the ball, tried to down it, but away it skidded. Andy recovered, and with the opposite end zone about 106 yards away, all 5'7", 135 pounds of half-hero Andy Petrovic made a run for it. Like a fox before the hounds, he ran desperately, slipping time and again from tacklers. But at midfield, with every mammoth after him, he was nailed from behind. Down he went. The ball slithered out of his hands. Mammoths were after it like falling bombs, but the mud defeated them. In the wild, slippery scramble, it was Andy who made the grab and hung on. Off he went at top speed, Rob Cargill right on his heels. It was Rob's last chance to demolish Andy, and he meant to use it. But Andy stayed just ahead of that beefy paw. Rob tried to rip the hated number 0 uniform off Andy's back, but Andy pulled away just in time. Gus, not missing a thing, took time out to glance at Andy's papa. That should make him happy. And then Gus heard the fans go wild. He looked quickly back to the field. Pandemonium! Andy was over the Mammoth line. Atoms 33, Mammoths 28. In the whole wild crowd, there was just one quiet looker-on. Gus. He watched Papa thump Andy's back. This is my boy, Israel hero. The players, showing agreement, lofted Andy to their shoulders for a triumphant departure from the wildest Super Bowl game ever played. Coach Venner couldn't stand such luck. He quietly fainted. As Gus looked away, the coach was being fanned with a wet towel. In the middle of the celebration, Hank Cooper went over to Gus. He reached out and patted him. Too bad, old-timer. Even the best of them slip once in a while. He started off after the others. Gus watched as Debbie came toward him. So, even the best of them slip, she said, winking at Gus. Who slipped? Gus almost seemed to smile. Every son should be a hero to his father, right, Gus? Debbie gave the Atom's most famous place kicker a warm hug. Giving his ears a tremendous circling wiggle, Gus proudly brought them up in a V for victory signal. Then, nodding slightly to the departing fans, he and Debbie left to join their teammates and Papa Petrovic's hero son, Andy. Thank you for listening to Gus by Vic Crume. This is your narrator, Amy Mullen. I had surgery a week ago, and I've been reading this book while on prescription pain medication. Otherwise, I don't think I could have made it through this book. So if this book is more painful to listen to than normal, if you feel like you're in a deeper circle of hell than you usually are when you listen to an audiobook for the damned, you might want to ask your own doctor for some prescription pain medication. It makes it easier. It'll still be painful. It will never be painless, but it might ease a bit of the pain. One other point about Gus is that while I do like mules, I think mules are a-okay in my book, I know absolutely nothing about football, and I've tried to learn stuff about football, and it just doesn't sync up with my brain at all. So, I probably messed up a lot of the nuances of the football game depictions in this. So once again, though, I will blame the prescription medication. My surgery went well, by the way, too. Thank you for listening to Gus. Thank you for listening to Audiobooks for the Damned. And I'm really, really sorry. Thanks, though.